one thing I want to, I don't know, we're kind of running out of time. That hour went by really fast, but I never got to ask you about the tear down this wall speech. I guess what's interesting about that speech, I think, for the audience is that it almost didn't happen
Yes.
in the way that it
Yes.
did. So it's such an iconic line, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But it wasn't an iconic line at the time. Is
No.
something I didn't know. It became an iconic line later when the wall actually fell. So,
Right.
what was the drama associated with putting this sort of bold language in there about the wall, about the divisions between East and West? Explain how you were thinking through that. This is one of the speeches you wrote in its entirety, right?
Correct.
And was edited very little.
Well, yes. I mean, it went through. Okay, I'll just tell you the story. The important point of the story, I'll tell you the conclusion. I'll start with where it ends. Well, it starts and ends in the same place, and that is with Ronald Reagan. So I was a 29-year-old speechwriter. Word came down that the president was going to be speaking in West Berlin, and I went with the pre-advance party to West Berlin to get material. You know what a pre-advance party is, but for the listeners, they're press people who are going to be looking at camera angles, security people who are going to liaise with the West German police to make sure the president's trip is secure at each moment, so forth. And then I went along. And I went to the place where the president would speak, right in front of the Berlin Wall, and I climbed an observation deck and looked over into East Berlin. This is just impossible to convey to people who didn't see it for themselves. But there you were in West Berlin, light, color, prosperity, lots of Mercedes-Benzes, sense of action, activity, modern city, and you look over the wall and all the color disappears. Gray, very few automobiles. The biggest part of the people you can see is soldiers, ordinary pedestrians walking slowly as if they had no place particularly to go, because I suppose they didn't. And you could just feel the weight of oppression, of communism. It was real. You could feel it. And then I went to have a meeting with the ranking American diplomat in Berlin, who said, listen, don't make him sound like a commie basher, and don't make a big deal out of the wall. They've all gotten used to it by now. And at the end of the day, I went to a dinner that was put on for me by some West Germans, Berliners. I'd never met any of them, but we had friends in common in Washington. And I told them that the American diplomat had said they'd all gotten used to the wall by now. Was that true? And the hostess at that event said, they went around, different people talked about the wall. They were, one man raised his arm and he pointed and he said, my sister lives just a few kilometers in that direction, but I haven't seen her in more than 20 years. How do you think we feel about that wall? So it became clear they'd stopped talking about it, but they hadn't gotten used to it. They still hated it every day. And our hostess said, if this man Gorbachev is serious with this talk of glasnost and perestroika, he can come here and prove it by getting rid of the wall. So I put that in my notebook. Why? Because I knew Ronald Reagan. I knew that Ronald Reagan would have responded to that remark, that the simplicity, the authenticity, the truthfulness of what she said. Okay. There's a much longer story here, but in brief, I constructed the speech around the call to tear down the wall. I had a lot of help in working things through, deciding that we could pull it off, from my boss, Tony Dolan, the chief speechwriter, and from a guy called Tommy Griscom, who was director of communications. And we sent it into the president. We pulled a little bit of a fast one on the staff to get it to him before it went out to staffing. That wasn't the way things were supposed to work in the Reagan White House, but we were young and we pulled a fast one. We got it to him. And then there was a meeting in the Oval Office, and we discussed a number of speeches, and then we got to my speech. And I explained to the president that I'd learned in Berlin that people would be able to hear the speech on the other side of the wall, the communist side of the wall. So is there anything in particular you want to say to them? And the president thought for a moment, and he said, well, there's that line about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to go. That wall has to come down. And then the speech went out to staffing. And I think it was 3 weeks between that day and the day the president delivered the speech. And the State Department and the National Security Council fought the speech for all 3 weeks. They submitted one draft after another, every one of which omitted the call to tear down the wall. And finally, in Europe, Ronald Reagan decided he was just going to deliver the speech as written and include that line. Ken Duberstein, who was with him in the limousine on the way to the Berlin Wall and who just died 6 months ago or so, said that by the way, that very morning, the State Department submitted another alternative draft. They were trying to talk him into it. And he told Ken Duberstein in the limousine on the way to deliver the speech that he was going to stick with the first draft. And then he leaned over and slapped Duberstein on the knee and said, the boys at State are going to kill me for this, but it's the right thing to do. So it was Reagan. I wouldn't have written that for anybody else. George Bush, God bless him. I loved George Bush. But whenever I gave him a foreign policy speech, the first question he would ask was, have you cleared this with State? And Ronald Reagan didn't mind overruling State if he thought they needed to be overruled.
They worked for him.
They worked for him, correct.